Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Maiden and the Sublime Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Often, to amuse themselves, the crewmen catch albatrosses, vast seabirds which follow, indolent companions of the voyage, the ship gliding on the bitter gulfs. Hardly have they put them on deck when these kings of the azure, clumsy and ashamed, pitifully let go their great white wings, like oars dragging alongside them. This winged voyager, how awkward and weak he is. He, once so beautiful, he's so funny and ugly. One teases his beak with a pipe stem, another mimes, limping, the cripple that once flew. The poet is like this prince of the clouds, who haunts the tempest and laughs at the archer. Exiled on the ground, in the midst of jeers, his giant wings keep him from walking. Charles Baudelaire, The Albatross. Well, hi everybody, and it's about time I thought on the channel that we had a bit of heavy metal. And from the get-go, full disclosure, I know very little, as will become apparent very quickly, about heavy metal. But I thought it was interesting because I think it's the second longest song Iron Maiden produced in 1984. It was their album Powerslave, and they did the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I think it's about 13 and a half minutes, and quite complicated orchestration within the piece, and quite loyal to the original. I think there are segments of the original poem quoted within the lyrics. And it just fascinates me that a poem like this could be of such interest to a heavy metal band. So I want to explore why that is. And just to, again, full disclosure about my personal experience of heavy metal, I have sung a thing called Love by The Darkness in a karaoke bar. And let's put it this way, grown men cried. So that's the effect I had. It was very emotional for everyone involved. I could have earned a fortune if someone had collected for me just to pay me to stop. And then on another occasion, it was like the worst fashion faux pas of all time. If you've ever heard of double denim, when I was a lot younger, for some bizarre reason, I went to, I wasn't planning on going. I got dragged along at the end of a very complicated night. But there was a place in Manchester called Gillies Rock World near the Palace Theatre. And it was a heavy metal and goth place. And I went in, not just double denim, I went in white, cream coloured double denim. And the colour du jour was definitely noir. And I looked like a character for anyone who recognises the reference from Randall and Hopkirk, deceased. But anyway, quickly moving on. So this is images from various concerts that involved this song, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Iron Maiden. So you can see that they've gone to quite a lot of effort to create atmosphere, to quote Russ Abbott. And the scale of it's quite impressive. So why did they do this, and what relevance is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner? Well, this is the guy who wrote it. Absolutely fascinating, maladroit, gauche. I'm trying to think of non-French words to describe. Just an awkward man who struggled to seem to live a normal life, but as a lot of artists has constantly referred to the lives of artists on this channel, and like Kafka, they tend to be quite dysfunctional. In inverse, the success with which they lead a normal life seems to be inversely proportional to their genius as an artist, and I don't think Coleridge was an exception. So I don't normally read an awful lot of biographies. I have read a lot of biographies relating to Kafka and Dostoevsky, because their background in Middle Europe and Russia
respectively, are important to their work, and they inform it quite a lot. But I recommend highly this biography by Richard Holmes, Coleridge, Darker Reflections. And I just wanted to quote you some sections to give you a sense of life on board the ship, because in 1804, Coleridge actually went on a voyage into the Mediterranean. So his poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was not ill-informed in the sense that he had a very good idea of what life on board a ship was actually like. And I think that actually contributes to the verisimilitude, the accuracy of the poem. But there are some, again, it's all about apologies today, but I have an incredibly, as you will probably found out already by now if you're a regular, but if you're new to the channel, I have a very puerile sense of humour. And I've just laughed out loud at some of the bits in this book. So forgive me, and if you're triggered by a literary analysis of constipation, maybe now is the time to disengage from the video, but don't tell me you weren't warned. But anyway, so this is from the biography by Richard Holmes. And when you see double quotation marks, he's actually quoting from Coleridge's own notebooks. So the most of the text is Richard Holmes, but then you might see direct quotations from Coleridge's notebooks when he was on board the ship. He wrote voluminous notebooks, and the one he's quoting from is obviously about the voyage in 1804. So Coleridge had two fellow passengers. They shared the cabin in increasingly pungent intimacy as the voyage progressed. One was a purple-faced lieutenant on half pay who largely restricted his attentions to the ship's claret. The other was a plump and garrulous merry widow, a Mrs. Island, who would have wanted elbow room on Salisbury Plain. Salisbury Plain, as should be obvious even to non-UK people, it's a large expanse, geographical expanse of open air, basically. So the joke being she needed a lot of room, which I might remember that. Who would have wanted elbow room on Salisbury Plain is a good one. The cabin conditions were extremely cramped and probably not improved by Coleridge's tendency, in very gusty weather, to vomit up his food without warning, as you do. The process intrigued him because it was never accompanied by seasickness. It was an action as mechanical, seemingly, as that by which one's glass or teacup is emptied by a thwart blow of the sea. Surprisingly, the merry Mrs. Carnosity accepted this with good grace. So Coleridge gave Mrs. Island the nickname of Mrs. Carnosity. But it gets worse, trust me. But the idea that you can imagine the cramped quarters. And at one point he mentions the foul-smelling bilge as the voyage progressed. The smell from the bilge got worse and worse and worse. So then he makes this makeshift cupboard from netting that he hangs from the port window. And inside the seaman, like, he uses books at the bottom of some netting so then he can rest his writing implements. So inside the seaman-like cupboard, he carefully arranged his shaving things, teacup and soup plate, supply of lemons, obviously to stop scurvy, and portable inkstand, whose unmoving pool of black ink seemed a suggestive contrast to the ceaseless lurching of the ship. I think it's a lovely image in the biography because it actually shows you the way in which poets can make something of the smallest thing. So amidst the turmoil of a ship, there's this image that I think is incredibly resonant of a portable inkstand. So there's a little tiny bit of black ink that doesn't move amidst this heaving monstrosity of a ship. By charm and talismanic privilege, one of those smooth places in the Mediterranean where the breakers foam in a circle around, yet send in no wrinkles upon the mirror bright, mirror smooth, lacus in mare, lake in the sea in Latin. Like the charmed pool of the imagination, the steady inkwell amidst the churning sea was imperium in imperio, a realm within a realm. This is what he hoped to become himself. So as we'll find out in a second when we dive into the actual poem, as the poem progresses, and it depends if people like this video. I'm only going to do the first part of the poem, but please give me comments back if you want more. I can do the whole poem. It just got too much because I wanted to show you some accompanying images, which I'll explain also in a second. And I wanted to do some analysis of the actual text because I planned just to read out the whole poem. The drawback with that is that there's actually, I recommend on YouTube, there's Richard Burton, the famous Welsh actor, does a stunning reading with the same Gustave Doré images that I'm going to use in this video. So I can't compete with Richard Burton. What I can do is do some analysis that he doesn't do. But I recommend thoroughly the Richard Burton reading. And on a slight tangent, Richard Burton also does a brilliant reading of Under Milk Wood, the Dylan Thomas poem. And his voice is just to die for. I'm trying to think of any other. There's Barry White I've mentioned earlier, his great voice. Alan Watts, I like his voice. But I would have Richard Burton up in probably my top 5 of voices, male voices of all time. But this idea of the inkwell amidst the churning sea, as the poem progresses, it gets interesting when the ship gets trapped in a part of the sea when they don't move. They're just trapped in this static water. And there are lots of obvious parallels that can be made with psychological states, and that I'm going to suggest as we go along is what the poem is about. And I think I'm backed up here. That's an unfortunate phrase in regard to what's to come, but I'm backed up by Richard Holmes. This is what he hoped to become himself, this calmness within the sea. But I do think there are parallels or resonances between Coleridge's own life and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And one of those is Bruce Dickinson. I saw a video of when he performs the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He must have done loads of performances, so I can't remember which precise one. But he mentioned that the poem was written under the influence of drugs, and he wrongly said that it was under the influence of marijuana. It wasn't. Coleridge was a opium addict, and in the form of laudanum, which was like a tincture. It was a diluted. You added the liquid form of opium to alcohol or some other liquid, and took it that way. And it was very common, and you could get it widely available, and you could get it in pharmacies, chemists, without any prescription. And part of the reason he went on the voyage was to try and to get distance from his domestic situation and try and get rid of this addiction. And he arrives, I think the first stop is Malta, and he arrives to find out that it's a very important product or commodity in Malta, so he couldn't get away from it anyway, despite the best intentions. So the opium doses had completely blocked his bowels. The shame, guilt, and horrid symbolism of this seized upon him. His body had closed upon itself, just as his mind had become fruitless and unproductive. He was a vessel full of mephitic horror. His journal becomes extraordinarily explicit, my puerile sense of humour, and details his sufferings with weird, unsparing exactitude. I laughed when I read he was a vessel full of mephitic horror. If anyone's following the Apple TV series Slow Horses, the Gary Oldman character, that would be a perfect description. He was a vessel full of mephitic horror. And if you've been watching the latest series, you'll know exactly what I mean. So this is from the diary. Tuesday, sorry, I'm going to try and not corpse. Tuesday night, a dreadful labour and fruitless throes of costiveness, individual feces and constricted orifices, went to bed and dozed and started in great distress. I have to resist the temptation to act this out, or I might traumatise some of you. Wednesday, the 9th of May, was a day of horror. He spent the morning sitting over a bucket of hot water, face convulsed, and the sweat streaming from me like rain. I've got to be careful what the running commentary consists of. I better stop myself. Captain Finlay brought the Speedwell, that's the ship he's on, alongside the Maidstone, which is another ship that should be italicised, and sent for Mr. Hardy, who's the surgeon. The surgeon instantly came, went back for pipe and syringe, and returned, and with extreme difficulty and the exertion of his utmost strength, injected the latter. Good God, what a sensation when the obstruction suddenly shot up. Coleridge lay with a hot water bottle on his belly, with pains and sore uneasiness and indescribable desires, instructed to retain himself as long as possible. At length went, oh, what a time, equal in pain to any before. Anguish took away all disgust, and I picked out the hardened matter, and after a while was completely relieved. And then this is my favourite line in the whole biography. The poor mate who stood by me all this while had the tears running down his face. The poor guy. Anyway, so there's an image to put you off your dinner. But just to give you a sense, and meanwhile you've got Mrs. Island and the permanently drunk lieutenant on the in his cabin, and this poor guy whose job it was to help him out. All the money in the world wouldn't compensate you for that. So when we look at the poem in a second, the Gustave Doré did the illustrations for some editions, and he also did illustrations for a number of a very popular illustrator. I'm a massive fan of his work, but Gargantua and Pantagruel, Don Quixote, there's some brilliant illustrations I've referred to in other videos. Paradise Lost and John Milton and the Divine Comedy by Dante, and I think they're absolutely stunning. And this is The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe. I just think he adds something to stories, and it's so the chiaroscuro, the black and white, because it's like ink etchings, but I don't know, I just find them really atmospheric. This is Lucifer falling to earth from Milton's Paradise Lost, which I think is a stunning picture. And then he also illustrated various parts of the Bible, and this is, I think, my favourite Gustave Doré picture of all time. He's incredibly evocative. This is the darkness at the crucifixion. So, to give some background to the poem before we start, there's lots of different theories of what the Sublime is that I've referenced in the title. But in terms of there's three famous, I'll just give you a rough, this is like the Bluffer's Guide to aesthetic theories of the Sublime. So you had a guy called, he's referred to in literature as Pseudo Longinus, who was a Greek writer in the 1st century AD. And interestingly, Longinus, given the previous image, Longinus was the name of the centurion at the crucifixion. But in his very early text on the Sublime, he defined the concept of the Sublime in terms of the ability to be transported, and he was referring to speeches. So Cicero in ancient Rome was a very famous rhetorician, famous for his ability to sway an audience. So that was the notion, his notion of the Sublime. And in this concept of the Sublime, it's unclear whether the quality of sublimity resides in the object or the subject. Is it the thing being witnessed that's sublime, or is it you, the viewer or the listener in this case, who brings a feeling of the sublime? and in Longinus it's not clear. Then you have Edmund Burke, and he wrote this key piece of philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. He obviously didn't work for an advertising agency. And for Burke, there was a definite concentration of the quality of the sublime in the object rather than the recipient of the object, the subject. So this is directly from that work. Terror is in all cases whatsoever, either more openly or latently, the ruling principle of the sublime. The passions are delightful when we have an idea of pain and danger without actually being in such circumstances. This delight I have not called pleasure because it turns on pain. So Burke's trying to think about what is the emotion of the sublime. And I mentioned the phrase sublime in the title of this talk because it goes to why would a heavy metal band like Iron Maiden, what I'm curious as to what drew their attention to this poem. And I'd argue that all good music, all good art, theatre, whatever, engages with concepts of the sublime. So in something like as relatively extreme as heavy metal, you're also engaged in what's known as, in sociology, as the collective effervescence of a crowd. You get caught up in the crowd sensation. In a football crowd, I mean proper football, not, fake rugby like the American football, but real soccer. There's the sublime scoring of a goal. There's that special moment, which I'd argue is actually quite unique to proper football, because many sports have their own rhythm, but I do think the rhythm of football is actually unique. So I'm trying to think. I was at UCLA for one of their home games in the late 80s, and I saw they won the basketball, and they won the very end. And what I found in the basketball game was the first 90% of the game is just dull. But the last 5 minutes were amazingly exciting because every basket counted. And this is what I mean about the concept of the sublime. There are rhythms in various sports that when you're part of a crowd and you get caught up in the moment, there's the beauty of a goal. Yes, I suppose you can have a three-pointer that's, sublime, but goals are relatively a lot rarer. And I'm clumsily trying to point just to the notion of the sublime in a sporting context. But Burke is talking about this concept of terror, and it interests me with heavy metal, as we'll see shortly. The imagery, the artwork, as you've seen from the thumbnail, but also later on, there's an engagement with terror for aesthetic purposes. The whole concept, the imagery of the Iron Maiden logo and stuff. So Burke is drawing attention. He says terror is in all cases whatsoever, either more openly or latently, the ruling principle of the sublime. It's a way of engaging with fear and terror in a productive manner. So the passions are delightful when we have an idea of pain and danger without actually being in such circumstances. So it's the enjoyment of pain and danger without actually having to go through it. This delight I have not called pleasure because it turns on pain. And then you have Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Judgment. He had this two types of the sublime. There's the mathematical and there's the dynamic. And the best way to think about that is the mathematical. My personal experience of that would be the Grand Canyon. I went to see the North Ridge, which I don't think is as big as the Southern Ridge, but lots of people say it's prettier, for want of a better word. It's a bit of a pathetic word and a pathetic adjective for something as vast as the Grand Canyon. It's a bit more scenic, the Northern Ridge, apparently. But I was overwhelmed by the mathematical, in other words, the scale, the hugeness. You actually feel somewhat overwhelmed, and that's the mathematical. The dynamic corollary of that would be if you're in the middle of a storm or a typhoon or something, and you get a very real sense
of the absolute dynamic power of nature. That would be an example of the dynamic. And for Kant, the concept of the sublime is brought by the subject who's undergoing the experience. So this is from the Critique of Pure Judgment. The feeling of the sublime is a feeling of displeasure arising from the inadequacy of the imagination, the aesthetic estimation of magnitude to attain its estimation by reason, and simultaneously awakened pleasure arising from this very judgment of the inadequacy of the greatest faculty of sense. So it's an interesting perspective Kant takes. He basically argues that the sense of the sublime that we get when we see something stunningly beautiful or impressive, it's because paradoxically we can't process it with our minds. And in order to avoid becoming absolutely overwhelmed by the experience, we experience this inability to process it as a pleasurable experience. So that's all by way of background to, I would suggest, the poem itself, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, is full of conceptions of the sublime, the way in which the mariner comes up against simultaneously the terror and the beauty of nature and unseen forces, as we'll see in a second. But what I'm concentrating on today is part one, and it's by far the most complex. So when I've just this is all of part one, which I'm going to read in the following slides, but the stage direction just means it's not literally stage direction, but it's descriptive aspects of, for example, when the mariner first meets the wedding guest, it describes how the wedding guest has to sit down and so on. So whenever I say stage direction, it's some descriptive sentences. In the first part, the 6 lines of the wedding guest speaking, there's one stanza of dialogue and stage direction. And then you've got just these different types of either narration by the mariner, direction by the poet that stands behind, that's directing the mariner's voice. And then you've got a little bit of dialogue between the wedding guest, who the mariner is telling the tale to, and the mariner himself. So, and I'll explain as we go along, it's very cleverly done. You're dragged into the narrative, and then when Coleridge wants to, he shocks you into realizing that actually there's still a wedding going on, and there's someone who should have been at the wedding. And then he can change the tone, and then the vast majority of the rest of the poem is all just sheer narration. So sorry to give such a broken down mechanistic analysis, but it's just to show how subtly Coleridge actually uses the narration, the way he structures the poem. So close to the end, this is just to give you an idea of how I mentioned you're brought into the narrative. So this is very close to the end of the whole poem. So this isn't part one, this is the end of the whole poem that I'll look at in future. Since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns. Until my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. I pass like night from land to land, I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me. To him my tale I teach. So to give you the full context of this, he's shriven by a hermit. In other words, shriven, he's forgiven. This saintly hermit forgives him his sin of having shot the albatross. And having shot the albatross in the poem begs the question, what does that stand for? Because I think it's much more than just shooting an albatross. And that's why I think it's such a psychologically deep poem. And so that this towards the end, I think it's describing the way in which there's this urge to have to talk. And if you can step outside the poem for a second, I think this describes in therapy, it's pretty much called, it's often referred to as the therapeutic encounter. So when an analysis and the analysand, the person being analysed, meet together for the therapeutic encounter, it's called. That makes me think, what is an encounter? Because at the very beginning of the poem, you have the ancient mariner meets this wedding guest, and you can see here at the very end, the wedding guest is describing how whenever he gets this intense desire, he needs to share a story. So that this notion of an encounter, and that, what is an encounter? I think it implies authenticity. So, for example, what is the difference in an encounter and just meeting someone casually? An encounter has, I would suggest, associations of extreme significance, resonance, authenticity. It's not ordinary. You're expressing yourself truly. It's something different from the norm. And that's definitely what this poem is. So it's set up at the very beginning. He speaks to a wedding guest, as we'll see, in this odd encounter. And at the end, you find that the ancient mariner is going to keep doing that for the rest of his life. And I'd suggest that this, for me at least, represents nearly all authors, their need to talk about their experience in the form of writing. So this is a moment to flag up the future potential reading group on Proust's In Search of Lost Time. So please, if you get the chance, do go on the community post section and vote as if you're willing to participate in a future group just to look at the whole of In Search of Lost Time over, it'll take obviously quite a few weeks. But Proust, the whole theme of that book is about the art of writing and the way in which Proust shares his most vivid memories of his whole life. It just resonated with me. It has aspects of this ancient mariner needing to tell his tale. And this is from an essay, as you can see, Charles A. Owen Jr., Structure in the Ancient Mariner. As the mariner concludes his narrative, we learn one more important fact about structure. The tale he has told has attained its present form and effect through numberless agonized repetitions. The experience that has changed his life has in fact preserved it. And that reminds me of like the beginnings of literature and Western civilization, Homer. The people who told the Homeric tales were skilled at their art, and they honed it by constant repetition. They'd go from place to place to place, and the storyteller in ancient communities was very powerful and important. And it also reminds me, there's an essay by Isaiah Berlin about the fox and the hedgehog. And he uses that. He says some writers know. It's actually from, I'm trying to remember, it's a Greek poet, Archilochus. And he said, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And Isaiah Berlin, in this famous essay, uses that as a way of discussing various writers. So he picks on Tolstoy and says Tolstoy had the talent of a fox. He had a many-faceted talent. But he had a tendency, he had the convictions of a hedgehog. So War and Peace, partly because it was published in installments, I think he responded to some of the feedback he got, and he kept repeating some of his themes about history.
but I found from memory, it's a long time since I read it, but War and Peace had quite a repetitive tone because Tolstoy started getting fixated on a particular theme about history and people's role in it. But with the great calm, as experience intensifies into suffering, so the great calm, the ship goes into this static part of the sea. With the great calm, as experience intensifies into suffering, the nature of the narrative changes. The geography of journey disappears from the poem. The external and internal worlds fuse. What we witness is man striving to account for the incomprehensible and using as evidence all that his awareness encounters, dreams, visions, the vivid moments of insight when the creatures and the things of the outside world are possessed by the mind. It is a world full of presences and meaning. The ordinary, the repetitive, the routine no longer exist. I think this is a great description of what's so special about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner as a poem. This phrase, the external and internal worlds fuse. It's very discombobulating. It's not purely psychological because he's describing being on a ship, but this idea of the external, the internal worlds fuse. The sea is endless. And it becomes representative of a psychological space, one man alone on a ship where everyone else has died. The basic structure of the voyage is as true to fact as an Admiralty report. And now on this frame, as upon a loom, the imagination was to weave a magic pattern. But the magic plays like a strange light over a familiar landscape, upon a groundwork of fact deep-rooted as the continents themselves, and permeated with the elemental experience of humanity. So this is, again, a great, and it's difficult to get hold of this book, John Livingston Lowe's The Road to Xanadu. There are still paperback copies if you go second-hand bookshops or go searching online. But it's a fascinating book because he goes into, it's like a literary detective novel. There are notebooks, a big notebook of poorly annotated notes that Coleridge used as inspiration, little jottings of books that he'd read and little snippets of impressions he'd got from loads and loads of different books. And this author, it's with reference to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan. He shows where Coleridge got a lot of his ideas from and how he transported or transformed the most rudimentary little notes into this imaginative genius poem. So now we're going to begin to look at the actual poem and just again to focus on this, the vehicle of the encounter. So the whole thing starts with a wedding, and then the person who he interrupts, there's three people, one of whom is the next of kin to the bridegroom, who says, "Hold off and hand me greybeard loon." That's a bit close to home, that one. And what's important about that is the person the ancient mariner is talking to undergoes, it mirrors what the mariner himself underwent. In the whole poem, the mariner who kills the albatross commits this terrible sin or this crime and then is forgiven and then goes back constantly confessing to anyone, well, to certain significant people he can find. So he undergoes some type of religious conversion. And it's not a religious conversion, but the person he's speaking to, the wedding guest, when he first hears, he wants to get into the wedding. He doesn't want to listen to this hold off and hand me greybeard loon. He wants to be left alone. Very quickly, he becomes
inveigled into the story, like we, the reader. So the wedding guest, to some extent, stands in for us. And the wedding guest and we are converted, not so much the reader, because we're already interested in what is this all about, but the wedding guest represents this conversion from a reluctant listener to an active listener. And then there's layered perspectives at the very beginning, as you're about to see. The mariner describes the view from both, in the very first stanzas, from both on the ship and from the land, the view that you'd have of the ship disappearing over the horizon. And the poet is behind the main narrative, describing, I mentioned before, the stage directions, inverted commas. The voice of the actual poet is behind the mariner's narrative voice. So this is again from the actual poet. The wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon. He's beating his breast because he doesn't want to have to listen. He wants to go to the wedding. And then, for all you musical nerds, apparently the bassoon, this is an anachronism. The bassoon didn't exist at the time. The poem is set in medieval times. You can tell that from the thing about the crossbow and some other clues. I think Coleridge, one of his friends, had donated a bassoon to a local church, so I think it was on his mind. But also the bassoon arguably is quite otherworldly, subterranean-like. It's quite an evocative, deep, catonic instrument. God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. So this is how quickly he achieves it poetically. He's gone from not being interested and wanting to go to the wedding to being really emotionally involved and speaking. So it's in the second stanza, it's the wedding guest speaking to the mariner. And then it segues into the second bit. He's being replied to immediately. With my crossbow, I shot the albatross. It's the speed with which, and we'll see at the very, very first stanza, the way in which the poem's introduced, the way in which key things happen so quickly. And I'd argue one of the main messages from the whole poem is that this idea of undergoing a conversion, in order to undergo a conversion, you have to experience quite dramatic, upsetting things. So just to repeat, the whole poem is about the ancient mariner's psychological conversion, religious conversion, terrible experiences, feeling of the supernatural. It's all quite dramatic stuff. The wedding guest mirrors that on a much lower level. But it just made me think of, if you think of, I like the phrase affluenza, the way in which in modern times people are shielded from experience. And that makes them psychologically less able to deal with the inevitable aspects of life that are difficult to deal with. So in that sense, I think the poem is against the current cultural climate. It's about the need to experience, as quite humorously earlier on, Coleridge did himself on the actual voyage to the Mediterranean in 1804. So that's quite a long preamble. So now to start the actual, I was going to say start the actual poem, but before we can do that, I think there were 18 versions of the poem, because Coleridge kept responding to people's criticism of the poem. But the one I'm using for the purposes of this video, the 1834 version, and I'll read you now. This is the epigraph at the beginning of the poem that Coleridge himself used. So you can see it's by a Thomas Burnet. I easily believe that in the universe the invisible natures are more numerous than the visible ones. But who will clarify for us the family of all these natures,
the ranks and relationships and criteria and functions of each of them. What do they do? In what places do they dwell? The human mind has always searched for the knowledge of these matters, but has never acquired it. Meanwhile, I do not deny that it is from time to time useful mentally to picture in the mind, as on a tablet, the image of a larger and better world, so that our minds, preoccupied with trivial matters of everyday life, does not shrink excessively and subside entirely into petty ideas. We must, however, be careful about the truth and keep a sense of proportion, so that we may discriminate between the certain and uncertain, day from night. So it's clear for Coleridge, at least, that this poem is about the intangible, the untouchable aspects of life that are, to some extent, no less real. So then the poem begins, and what I'm going to do is show you on each slide from the 1834 edition, the Gustave Doré illustrations. And I'll just let you have a look at them as now, and then I'll have the text each time. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me? The bridegroom's doors are open wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mates hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoth he. Hold off and hand me, grey-beard loon. Eftsoons his hand dropped he. Eftsoons, just for the language, by the way, eftsoons just means immediately. Loon actually doesn't come from lunatic. It wasn't until I believe, the late 19th century that the phrase loony came into the English language. And loony came from lunatic, whereas loon was an old word, archaic word for clownish character. And I love the very abrupt beginning. It is an ancient mariner. And there's various things to say about the actual style of the poem. So I pointed out earlier on, there is some complexity. But from an initial look, it's a very basic traditional stanza form. And within that, he achieves great complexity. And I'll show you later on some of the techniques he uses. The other thing is the wedding feast. It provides this stark contrast. It's a time of celebration. It's a serious ceremony, but it's then about people having fun as two people go off into a life of psychological bondage, joking. The idea that the terror, the sublime terror that the ancient mariner is going to talk about, contrasts with the happy clappy nature of a wedding. So that acts as a contrast, a framing device. And then just the actual, right, the very first line, the concept of an ancient mariner. You could ask yourself, how would it have been different if that was, it is an old sailor? It's the ancient mariner. The choice of words creates this atmosphere of the uncanny. And the uncanny, unheimlich in German, is a concept to be exploring in detail in future videos. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years' child. The mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone. He cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. The ship was cheered, the harbour cleared. Merrily did we drop, below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. The main thing there I'd say is the glittering eye. I did do a very early video in the channel about the look with reference, I think it was to Renoir and Sartre and all sorts, but the idea of the look, the eye, is an age old in many cultures, the superstitious notion of the eye, the evil eye. And apparently in Coleridge's actual own time, there wasn't such an obvious superstition. I think in Turkey and Greece, there's still this idea blue eyes are part of the evil eye mythology, and you can buy amulets to protect you against the evil eye. But so I was going to say, within Coleridge's own time, they still did believe mesmerism, hypnosis was very popular. And they did believe, for example, that snakes paralyze their victims because of their glittering eyes. Oh, and then just one more observation. The last two lines of the first stanza are actually written by Wordsworth. Wordsworth chatted with Coleridge about the idea of this poem, and they were, I think, two lines that Wordsworth himself came up with that Coleridge used. But just on this idea of the glittering eye, it reminded me of this. I think it's a brilliant painting. It's Franz von Stuck, The Sin. And it reminded me also in Geraldine, there is a character, she's a witch in Coleridge's poem Christabel, which was this unfinished poem. And she has the evil eye. The sun came up upon the left, out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea. Higher and higher every day, till over the mast at noon, the wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon. The bride hath paced into the hall, red as a rose is she, nodding their heads before her goes the merry minstrelsy. So I think I mentioned the bassoon. It didn't exist then. The red as a rose is she, the blushing bride. Contrast later on, you see the spirit of death is described as that almost got like a white leprous complexion. So that's an obvious contrast. And then there's the nodding their heads just refers to the minstrels are making their music, so they'd be nodding around in time to the music. And then when they approach as they go on the journey, this is John Livingston Lowe's The Road to Xanadu. He describes how cleverly Coleridge describes the journey as efficiently as possible. It is all as expeditious as a magic carpet. The vertical sun stands over the mast for an instant at noon to mark the crossing of the line, in other words, the equator. Then the dramatic incursion of the wedding revelry, like the knocking in Macbeth, snaps for a moment the spell of the tale, and with the fine economy of a practised art, blots the superfluous first passage of the tropics completely from the poem. That is the most superb tour de force in the poem. The wedding guest he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear, and thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his o'ertaking wings, and chased us south along, with sloping masts and dipping prow, as who pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe, and forward bends his head. The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward aye we fled. And by the way, I think it is A rather than I, from memory. It's the way it's supposed to be pronounced. So the first stanza, there's repetition of lines that are already being used, and that's how traditionally it was done. But then notice the third stanza has a different rhyme scheme. And in that particular section where it says, where are we? The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast. The rhymes become quicker and quicker in time with what's being described. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled, like noises in a swound. At length did cross an albatross, through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. So swound is an archaic word for swoon, and what's interesting about that is, apparently, it's linked to the word sound. So swound, sound. It's just a multi-purpose word, this swound, because archaic word for swoon, and apparently that occurred, that derivation, because the belief was that when you came round from a fainting fit, you had a sudden inrush of sensory perception, and you heard very odd noises. So it's a great word because it suggests all these things together: sound, wind, a wound, a swoon. All these things are brought together in one like multi-purpose word. And this is just mentions of the albatross. So I think Holmes thinks that Coleridge had almost certainly read this, which is by Captain George Shelvocke, Voyage Around the World by the Way of the Great South Sea. So one would think it impossible that any living thing could subsist in so frigid a climate, and indeed we all observed that we had not had the sight of one fish of any kind since we had come to the southward of the Straits of Le Maire, nor one seabird, except for a disconsolate black albatross who accompanied us for several days, hovering about us as if he had lost himself. A couple of things to say about that. The Straits of Le Maire, it actually is spelled that way in the original, because this is from 1726. Same with albatross. There's a non-standard spelling. But I love that phrase, hovering about us as if he had lost himself. But it's the uniqueness of the albatross, I think. If you actually think about why was Coleridge fixated on that one particular bird, and I think the answer is because in the midst of such an isolated place, it is the only living creature, at least above sea. You don't know what's under the surface, but above sea, it's the only living creature that could survive out there. And then this, it reminded me there's a brilliant, I'm going to have to do Moby Dick at one point in the future. But this is from chapter 43 of Moby Dick, The Whiteness of the Whale. Bethink thee of the albatross, whence come those clouds of spiritual wonderment and pale dread, in which that white phantom sails in all imaginations. Not Coleridge first threw that spell, but God's great unflattering laureate nature. So this is Melville referring back to Coleridge. And then this is in the main text of chapter 43 of Moby Dick, but there's an asterisk at the end, and then I'm going to read you the note that's below this. So it's in the form of a note in the novel. I remember the first albatross I ever saw. It was during a prolonged gale, in waters hard upon the Antarctic seas. From my forenoon watch below, I ascended to the overclouded deck, and there, dashed upon the main hatches, I saw a regal, feathery thing of unspotted whiteness, with a hooked Roman bill sublime. At intervals it arched forth its vast archangel wings, as if to embrace some holy ark. Wondrous flutterings and throbbings shook it. Though bodily unharmed, it uttered cries as some king's ghost in supernatural distress. Through its inexpressible strange eyes, methought I peeped to secrets which took hold of God. As Abraham before the angels, I bowed myself. The white thing was so white, its wings so wide, and in those for whoever exiled waters, and in those forever exiled waters, I had lost the miserable, warping memories of traditions and of towns. Long I gazed at that prodigy of plumage. I cannot tell, can only hint, the things that darted through me then. So there are elements of the Coleridge in this, the religious biblical references, and when I am definitely going to do something on Moby Dick in future, but there are so many biblical references to Abraham and the angels, and this, the inexpressible. Well, early on you've got the word sublime, but then the very last sentence, long I gazed at that prodigy of plumage, which is a great phrase. I cannot tell, I can only hint the things that darted through me then. So we can't actually say what was going on in his head, just to say it was supernaturally profound. So it uttered cries as some king's ghost in supernatural distress. Hamlet, Macbeth, all these ghostly references. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. It ate the food it ne'er had eat, and round it flew. The ice did split with thunder fit, the helmsman steered us through. And a good south wind sprung up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9, whiles all the night through fog smoke white glimmered the white moon shine. God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. So I just thought I'd draw all this to a close with some appropriate heavy metal imagery to go back to the original reference to Iron Maiden. And I hope you get a sense, I talked about deliberately the sublime rhyme. I used the rhyme about a rhyme using the word sublime in the title. But that's because as I've gone through with that long preamble, hopefully to prepare the ground, you see how the poem is so much more than just this constant repetitive rhyme. Within that rhyming structure, I just think it's an amazing achievement to bring in that much psychological depth. So let me know in the comments if you found this interesting, you want me to go through the rest of the poem, you need to shout out. But I'll just finish with one final image that it's a close-up of this, but I think it sums up this notion of the sublime and the earlier comments I made about terror. I asked myself the rhetorical question, why would heavy metal be interested in a poem like this? But I think this image, the aesthetics of this, it's how heavy metal processes the darker side of human nature and turns it into something to be enjoyed in a musical format. So I hope that's all made sense, and until the next time, I'll just leave you with this final close-up image of this. All the very best, take care.